Many modern mirrorless cameras and even some cinema cameras like this Canon C70 now have advanced autofocus tracking modes that can accurately detect faces, animals, vehicles, and even specific eyeballs. This level of accuracy means that you can often have your camera achieve smooth focus pulls automatically, whereas in the past you would have needed a follow focus or a dedicated focus puller. However, even the best autofocus system isn't foolproof, and even with amazing autofocus, there are still instances where manually pulling your focus may give you the better result. To test this out, we're going to take a look at a few different shooting situations and see which method works best for the look that we're going for. Autofocus tracking or manual focus. All right, so real quick, I just want to explain the setup that we're working with here. We have the Canon C70. We chose this because it's a great cinema camera that also has some pretty good autofocus capabilities. We have the Tilta manual follow focus system set up on the side here as well. So we're going to be doing a couple of different types of shots and setups, and we're going to see which one works better between the autofocus tracking on the Canon C70 and the manual follow focus. Obviously, every camera brand has their own autofocus system, so the results will vary a little bit depending on what camera you use, what the lighting situation is, but we figured this would be a nice, relatively level playing field to kind of show the difference. So we have our lovely subject here, Jorge, who is going to be helping us out for these first few shots. And we're going to start pretty simple. We're going to start with just Jorge walking towards the camera and away from it. We're going to see how the face tracking on the C70 handles that with just the autofocus. And then we're going to switch to the manual follow focus, and I will then try to keep him in focus while he walks forward and back. And we'll take a look and see what looks better. All right, so just go ahead and walk towards the camera. All right. And then step back. So what was really cool about that is the face detect. Now we have it on face priority, which means it's going to be looking for Jorge's face. Yeah, as he walks closer, it loses the eyes, but it still finds the face and stays on it, which is really nice. We have the peaking on so we can see exactly that we are still in focus. And it's doing a really good job of staying on him. Even if it drifts ever so slightly, it does it in a very natural way. It's not like hunting. So the autofocus for this works pretty well. But this is the easy stuff. So now we're going to try this with the manual focus. Now once again, this should be relatively easy. I've got these two screws here I can use to stop for the focusing points. So the best practice would be to rehearse this. So as an example, Jorge, if you can walk up closer. So in a narrative context, we want to see where he's going to be stopping, and then we'd find our focus there. Let's just get it in focus. Yep. And then go ahead and step back in. All right. Cool. So we have now found the two focus points. Now we're going to try this with me doing the manual focus. So go ahead and step forward. I underestimated the throw that I had to do at first. It was a little less gradual than I thought. But you can see the results. He's still in focus. This will be a recurring thread here, but the nice thing about manual focus is you can kind of dial in. If I wanted Jorge to be like slightly out of focus and then come into focus, I have that option, whereas the autofocus will just keep his face in focus the entire time, which probably the majority of the time is what you want, but just something to keep in mind. Now I want to try actually a tracking shot, by which I'll literally just be panning and tilting, following Jorge. We'll probably just have him walk like across back and forth. Go ahead and walk. And we've got the autofocus on. Cool. All right. So that was actually pretty good. You'll notice it followed his eye even as he was stepping into light and into shadows. Sometimes that can throw autofocus performance off a little bit. And then he stepped behind this light, and as soon as it lost his face, it gently started focusing on the light itself. So I was not sure if it was going to do that, so that was actually really good. But now we're going to try it with manual focus. Cool. So what happened there was I noticed that the two stopping points that I put didn't quite cover the full distance, so I'm actually going to do what is probably not a best practice, but I'm just going to kind of freehand it. I don't know if that's the actual term for it, but we're gonna call it that now. I'm just going to adjust the focus manually until I can see that Jorge is in focus, wherever that ends up being. So we're going to ignore the stopping points this time, just see how that looks. So I'm going to find you there. All right, and one more time, go ahead. This is interesting. So I was relying on the 3 triangles that Canon C70 offers to kind of line up when it was in focus, but the problem is when there's different objects in the way, like this light that Jorge walked behind, it then thought that that was the point of focus. So in this case, I probably should have leaned a little bit more into the focus peaking, because that will highlight in red what is in focus. But other than that, it did a pretty good job of keeping him in focus. He didn't move too much frontwards or backwards. It was mostly an even plane, so it shouldn't have been that tricky. But let us know what you think in the comments below, what you thought the final difference looked like to you. All right, now we're gonna try something slightly trickier. We have Dean, our subject, right in the foreground, pretty close focusing. Then we're gonna move to physical objects in the background. We're gonna try to throw the face detect off a little bit, and then back to Jorge all the way in the background, then back to Dean in the foreground. So we're doing multiple switching of the subject that we want in focus. The main thing I'm curious about here is to see if the autofocus can still kind of try to piece together what I want the subject to be that I'm looking at, or if it gets thrown off by this. So we'll take a look. So all right, so this was interesting. It did a pretty good job up until I did the whip pan from Jorge to Dean. It got a little bit stuck on the background for a second, and then like a second later, it found Dean's face. Did a pretty good job, especially with knowing that I was going from a face to objects back to another face. So pretty good. Now let's see if manual focus is a little bit easier with this. All right, so we've rehearsed the different points that the camera's going to be at. So we're going to take a look and see how manual focus works for this now. So kind of similar conclusions. Definitely the manual focus here took a little bit more work, just finding the 2 focus points first that I want to cut to, and then making sure that the subject in the middle, the table full of camera gear, also stayed in focus. But where manual focus was really helpful here was in that quick pan back from Jorge to Dean, because I already knew where Dean's point of focus was, and I didn't have to trust the camera to try to find it again when I whip panned. So once again, and I feel like this might be the recurring theme here, manual focus will take more work to set up, but seems to consistently give you more reliable results depending what you're going for. All right, so we're gonna do one more test on this. This one's actually pretty simple, but it's one that many different productions use, just a simple rack focus. So we're gonna start with one subject in the foreground, one subject in the background, start with one of them in focus, and then have it go to the other subject. Just go ahead and turn back to Jorge, and I'll pull focus. All right, and then turn back around. It once again did a very good job of pulling focus in kind of like a not overly fast way. It just pulled it very naturally. And once again, the nice thing about the C70 is it will let you know that it sees 2 different subjects in the frame, and you can actually use the dial here to move it to the subject you want to be in focus, or you can do what I did and just tap on what subject you want to be in focus. So now we're going to once again set up for manual focus, so I'm going to figure out where Dean is. So we are rolling, and Dean once again when the moment takes you. All right, so I find I'm sounding like a broken record with these takeaways. It was faster using autofocus and a little bit more convenient. I could just tap on the subject that I want. But what was nice about the manual focus is I could very intuitively just dial in how much I wanted the focus to change. Now, in almost any camera setup you have, you can control autofocus speed, so you can kind of set that accordingly if you want it to really quickly find focus or very slowly do it. But there's something to be said about just being able to intuitively by hand rack the focus as fast or slow you want. So once again, autofocus very fast and convenient. Manual is for all of you control freaks out there. So based on that footage we just got, here's a few takeaways about shooting manual versus autofocus tracking. If you're shooting anything that is not rehearsed or predictable, such as documentaries, wildlife, weddings, live events, you will likely want to lean into your camera's autofocus. If you're strictly tracking a single subject, like following a single human and keeping them in focus, autofocus will likely work best, and it might even work in a narrative context. However, anything stylistic, you'll most likely want to shoot manually. The main takeaway is that autofocus can't understand artistic intent. You sometimes have to tell it where you want it to go. Any type of focusing that doesn't specifically lean into an autofocus mode that your camera has will likely be safer to do manually as well. Also on that note, learning the strengths and weaknesses of your camera's autofocus modes by testing or practicing is another great way to learn about these workarounds. Finally, one last note, autofocus is typically less reliable in dark settings or in environments with rapidly changing contrast. So if you're following a subject from shadow to light, your autofocus might drift, so that's another instance where you might want to lean into manual focus. But what are your thoughts on manual focusing versus autofocus tracking? And where would you like us to pull your focus next? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Nick with B&H. Stay creative.